Good evening. This is Living in the Promised Land. I'm your host, Mark Schmorley, and I wanted to, before we start, thank Jeff Barsky, who did the intro and outro music with Insect Factory, and our producer, super producer, Stephanie Boutois. And today we are going to the border. We're going to Tucson, Arizona. We are going to speak with the founder of the Border Chronicle. Here is a 4-year anniversary toast to the Border Chronicle, which really is the only, they call themselves this, and it's true, the only independent, um, comprehensive border journalism source. That's not exactly how it's worded, but that's how I see it. I really urge people to subscribe and to subscribe to the paying subscription, which I have. You get an amazing bag with that, and I don't know whether gifts are there now. That's what they had when I subscribed, but you also get reminded of any articles, any interviews, and it is incredibly comprehensive. I am behind in reading it, and not because I'm not interested, but because I have to block out the time to read the articles because they really are deep, and you really will be educated by looking at it. And so we have with us Todd Miller. Todd also has written 4 books on the border. The first one I think is really the Bible of knowing the history of the Border Patrol. At least for me, it was coming from the Northeast, which we'll learn is part of the border. Um, it called Border Patrol Nation, and Border Patrol Nation talks about the history of the Border Patrol, and also the what stuck with me was the militarization of the border, the interest in so much corporate, the toys. I call them the toys, of the border. You give the government their toys, their militarization, their and the second book is Storming the Wall, which is one of the greatest titles of a book that I know. I mean, one I won't forget, which really it talks about climate change and its effect on borders and its effect on movement to different countries, and that is something that I've been interested in, and something that countries have been granting asylum, starting with New Zealand about 4 years ago. So, or actually in 2020. And so, um, without any further ado, Todd, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, so Todd, I don't
Oh,
think
I should
Trump
say,
had
I
great.
could I say one thing? Um, I'm co-founder of the Border Chronicle, along with Melissa Doboske, who's the other co-founder. Just wanted to mention that really quick.
Well,
Um,
and it's grown, and Todd, it's grown. It was in the 4 years you you've grown, because it used to be just you and Melissa, and then I see other names on these articles and other
yeah,
interviews, and
yeah, we have grown unbelievably. It's like
which
what it feels like. We're coming to our 4-year anniversary. It feels like we just keep for 4 years we've just been building this house, right? Brick by brick by brick. And then all of a sudden we look up and we have a bunch of rooms when it was just a one, just a one room hovel or something. And it's all of a sudden has a couple more rooms. Yeah. So it's it's 4 years have flown by, but yeah, now we seem to be expanding a little bit and expanding our coverage of the primarily the 2,000-mile U.S. Mexico border, but also we look at borders in general as well.
hmm right. And so I don't think Trump had been in office for, I don't think they had that inaugural day lunch yet by the time he signed an executive order saying that the border was an emergency. And the emergency came because of actions that happened in the last 4 years, because when he left, everything was secure, according to this memo. And he mentioned that the one of the lines from there is that America's sovereignty is under attack. Um, and one of the interesting ones was he talked about the horrific and inexcusable murders of many innocent American citizens, as if somehow he was telling us that murder is bad. And this is something that, is inexcusable because before that murder had been excused. And you know, it does come though after it did come after a period where um, you know, people, you know, as an immigration attorney, people come to the border and you have a choice. There's different choices to make. And, you know, during the Biden administration, there was I wouldn't say a mess, but there was a certain triage approach without making a lot of sense all the time. You know, they had the CBP1 app for a little while, and which meant that if you were on the app and you could schedule yourself an appointment, then you could come into the United States, and then you could be, you know, let in and paroled and apply for asylum later. But you know, not, of course, an app on a cell phone where you have reception in towers is a privilege, and there was reporting done, you know, and the reporting that was done had to be done in camps, you know, on the other side, and um, there was certainly privilege in that, and people and understanding of it, and so whether that was a direct attack on certain people or not, it was a bit of a mess, and so and there were also you know, when you hit certain numerical limits, they would turn people away, and then they would let people in and parole them, and then they would declare parole for certain countries when there came to be a lot of people. It was a reactionary policy. And so, you know, what we've got for those of us, you know, there are very few people that are really listening to this show that are listening to get more support in their advocacy for what this president's doing, what this regime is doing on the border with immigration. But there are many people that did support fairly blindly. You know, the Democrats saying, okay, they're the opposition, but you know, it was problematic because the border was not treated in a way, you know, it was a combination of militarization and parole, and it was confusing, and often people suffered because they came into the United States without any real idea of what was happening. They were given court dates that were fake, uh, way into, and then they were changed, and they were sort of, and it was confusing. And the idea was to sort of not be what Trump was, but not be seen. This perception of being, quote, soft on the border, which is why, you know, I talk about, you know, to me, it goes back, way back to, I mean, you can go way back on border, you know, and all of that, but really, when Clinton, especially in his second term, was you know, beginning to militarize the border and beginning to say, look, you're right, this is a problem. And he had a commission that said so. This is a problem, that people coming across the border at this rate is a problem. And when the Democrats wanted to pass a comprehensive immigration bill in 2013, at the very end, our hero of the show, um, you know, fighter for liberty, Chuck Schumer, said, "Oh no, no, we may have majority, but let's get a super majority and put, I think it was 600,000 Border Patrol on." And a baby congressman, uh, Beto O'Rourke, said, "No, no, no, this is destroying our communities." And for me personally, I was in, you know, Harlingen in law school in the mid 90s, but I hadn't been to the border since. I hadn't thought of the border. I'd been to Tucson once, but hadn't really, you know, thought of the border in the same way. And I said, "Oh, interesting. You know, why is he pushing back so hard?" And you know, he was really comprehensive about it and talked about what it does to these communities. And there's always this afterthought. And so and obviously what ICE is doing has taken over what CBP is doing. So, what are you seeing on the border with this troops troops there, fentanyl being stopped, drug trade being stopped? What's happening? What are you seeing overall?
You know, there's that report. I think that report about fentanyl that was, I believe, well, first of all, most of the drugs come over through the ports of entry. Um, you hear different percentages, but they're always over 80%, and some of the reports I hear are 90. And then the fentanyl itself, I believe, now, now listeners will have to go and fact check this exactly, but I think it was something like 90% or 85% of fentanyl being crossing the border is coming in the hands of U.S. citizens, so people from the United States. So just to throw in a couple little tidbits in there that you don't normally hear about, especially with all the different justifications and mind you, drugs crossing through the deserts and the U.S. Southwest is very much an image that's evoked as, especially in Washington, as people, vie for more money to further build up and fortify and militarize the border. And that, Mark, yeah, definitely we're seeing another degree of militarization. Now, it's important to contextualize the militarization that we're seeing now since January, since Donald Trump administration took power, is on top of a militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border, and I would argue also the U.S.-Caribbean border, but we can go into that another time. But the U.S.-Mexico border, that's been going on for decades. There's a great book by sociologist Timothy Dunn that's called The Militarization of the U.S.-Mexico Border that starts that process in 1978. So that gives you an idea how long this has been going on. And what the Trump administration has done is taken it to the next level. It's definitely a new level. And the main thing that they have done is declare what they call national defense areas. And national defense areas are these areas like swaths of border. And I believe there's 4 of them right now. But swaths, often large swaths of borders, such as the entire border of New Mexico with Mexico, the entire length of what the border that New Mexico has with Mexico is now a national defense area, for example, an NDA. And what that effectively does is take the international boundary line and in what is called the Roosevelt Reservation, which is about 65 feet. So that's it. But it turns that into a military base. So effectively, it's a military base, and what we've seen is images of combat vehicles, of soldiers. I believe there's 8,500 soldiers that have been deployed in the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly for these national defense areas, into these newly formed military bases. And these military bases then have they put up no trespassing signs, which so like any military base, a civilian cannot trespass. And if they do, it's a felony. So you have that additional layer of criminalization upon what's already criminalized, which is crossing the border. And so there's 4 of them. There's the one in New Mexico. There's one in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. There's one in West Texas around El Paso, and there's one around Yuma. And supposedly the whole border is going to be
Yuma's Arizona.
Yuma, Arizona,
Yes.
exactly. It's thought that the whole border will become a national defense area. That remains to be seen. I did do a report for the Border Chronicle in May, I believe, about the New Mexico one. And I went all the way along it looking for anything. And I didn't find, it was funny. I mean, there's all this reporting about the national defense area. And I went looking for soldiers. I went looking for military. I talked to local people. I went to Columbus, New Mexico. Now, mind you, Columbus is right on the border. Columbus has the history that Pancho Villa attacked Columbus in the early 20th century. So they have a Pancho Villa museum there. And I talked to people there, and that's the only attack besides the 9/11 attacks, by the way, in Pearl Harbor, but in the mainland United States. I talked to people there, they didn't even know about the national defense areas. So part of me thinks, well, there's a lot of hype around this, a lot of media display around this. And there are signs, but it's not as extensive. If there's hyperbole, I think it goes par for the course with Trump, right? There's a mixture of everything. There's a mixture of truth, and then there's a mixture of hyperbole and exaggeration of what it is. But what we're seeing there is a new layer of this militarization, and it's a militarization that that has gone on for a much longer time, and it expands much further than that 65 feet. I don't know, Mark, do you want me to talk about the 100-mile areas and that
Yeah, we
sort
can
of
get to
thing?
that in a sec, but I have a couple questions on this because I think, when it just comes to the border itself is, we've seen there were periods where and we know this by seeing people that were leaving water in the desert, et cetera, that people could come across the border at areas that were not places of entry. And certainly this is the way it was before. And one of the things that, you taught me, about 8 years ago, and I have to say, so much of what I know about the border originally, I've gone to other sources, but you piqued my interest with the book and then just, giving us a tour down there is how much you know people people weren't crossing the border under Biden without being detected. They were just allowed, if they crossed the border and they expressed a fear, and there's a pretty low bar because it's one person that interviews you at the border. They were allowed to come into the United States and then go to immigration court there. And we did talk about the amount of people that don't show up for court and all that. For the most part, people do. And to get their chance to be heard in court. But people were not generally in the last, parts of the Biden administration, even before that, were not going around because of the danger. And so that was something, when people have this idea that this was happening. This is just a different way to harass and treat them. And part of that was because of this surveillance. So when people um so what is the technology beyond, this is the show of force. We know that Trump lives in the 1970s. I mean, we're talking about his meme about Chicago from Apocalypse Now, and I had explained to my 19-year-old son, no, who is who's a took a course in college on film history and didn't know Apocalypse Now. I mean, people, there are references, boomers, right? That's why they say, okay, boomer, right? Because there are references even in our lives that our kids, if they're not their lives. And so the people that see that reference, but it's also he lives in a different era where military on the border is what does it. But really, what is it's really this technology, right? This
Yeah, with Biden, I think it's important to look at a couple different things. And one, like when he came into office, or one of his promises was he wasn't going to build one more foot of border wall, right? And then he followed that up with, more going to focus on technology, which for for me, like I've been studying this stuff for a long time. And you talk to Border Patrol, they're the first to tell you that we have a three-pronged enforcement system. They call it a border wall system that includes the border wall, but technology is a part of it. It's like there's not a difference to the Border Patrol perspective between technology and the wall. In fact, the technology is probably more of an enforcement mechanism than the wall itself because of its ability and capability of detecting crossing and people, and how more and more sophisticated it gets as it advances. And the other part of the prong was, of course, the personnel. So, like the armed agents, there's about 20 to 21,000 U.S. Border Patrol agents that are stationed in such a way that is through a kind of prevention through deterrence strategy, and it's a strategy that's been they've been enacting since the 1990s, really. And so the technology becomes when Biden took office, uh, that was the rhetorical stress he made was technology. Um, but rest assured, the border wall continued to be built. I remember going down to like Sasabe, which is a town just south of where I live in Tucson, on the regular, and just constantly running into the construction company there that was building. They said so that what they were saying, we're building the gaps in the border wall. So they were constantly they continue building the border wall effectively during the Biden, not quite the project that Trump was building, but they continued to do it. They did not take it down. Like there was no taking down of the border wall. There was the 30-foot wall segments that were built on many parts of Arizona, for example, not taken down at all. It was enhanced and built further. But the technology definitely an emphasis of the Biden administration. And one thing I look at as a journalist is the budgets versus the rhetoric. And when Biden took over, he inherited about a $24 billion budget, CBP. When I say that, I'm talking about Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The border and immigration enforcement mechanisms of Department of Homeland Security, right? So their combined budget was about $24 billion. And by the end of the Biden administration in the last year, 2024, it was over $30 billion. The first time it had gone over $30 billion. That budget had gone up. So the idea that there was a tailing back, or in terms of what the budget was saying, no, there was not at all. There was a further fortification of the border itself, the enforcement, the technology, for example. I did a look at the contracts to private companies that were given out during the Biden administration, and he by far surpassed any other president. The second in line was Trump in his first 4 years, and Biden beat him out. I think his final tally was about $32 billion of contracts given out, again, the CBP and ICE. And that $32 billion topped, I think Trump was about $21 billion. It topped him by over $10 billion. And looking at some of the Biden contracts, one of the biggest contractor was Deployed Resources. And it was a contractor that built tent encampments on the border. So if you're looking for somebody wanted to do some sort of mass roundup of people, well, Deployed Resources would be one of those companies that would build a tent camp or detention camp where people could be rounded up. Turns out that was the highest contractor during those 4 years of Biden. So you can see, in a way, like the way that it's often framed is that, oh, they totally, completely contrast each other. But in other ways, there's a complete continuation, right? And almost a handoff of, oh, here's like when Trump took office in the 2025, he took over the $30 billion budget for again, CBP and ICE for 2025. Here's a handoff to you. You have this gigantic budget that is $10 billion bigger than you had in 2017 when you took office. And now what can Trump do with those sorts of budgets and those sorts of capabilities and those sorts of capacities, which include both the Border Patrol, but also, as we know, ICE, which is this agency that, is, of course, seems to be the focus of the Trump administration or a little bit more this time.
So real quick before we pivot off to the 100-mile radius, is the when you talk about technology, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so technology is, I think, the best way to describe it. Even we're coming on the 9/11, right? The anniversary of 9/11 and the creation of Department of Homeland Security. But one of the things that spawned out of that was this idea of a virtual wall. So you have the actual physical wall, and mind you, again, for the Secure Fence Act of 2006 really was the biggest wall construction project ever enacted in the United States. And that was 2006. So that was coming out of 9/11 and Department of Homeland Security. And then another was called SBI Net, which is a Secure Border Initiative. And that's a technology part of it, a program. And what they called it, which made it a lot easier to understand for me at least, is a virtual wall. The virtual wall is then a technological wall. It's that, for example, in Arizona, we have these integrated fixed towers, which are basically surveillance towers. There's about 50 of them. They're like a spinal cord of a surveillance system that's not on the actual international boundary, but like maybe 5, 10, sometimes 20, sometimes 50 miles inland, that all coordinate with each other, send their feeds into command and control centers. So there's a sort of warlike atmosphere. Go into command and control centers where agents watch monitors, or often National Guard will watch monitors. you get the feeds from these towers, you get the feeds from drones. There's a fleet of drones. Predator bees are the main drone systems. They come from the company General Atomics. They were used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then given what they call a homeland security application, and have been flying, doing overflights of the border now for years. So those feeds go into the command and control centers as well. There's a whole slew of unmanned, unattended, what they call unattended ground sensors, which are underground sensors. So if you're walking along, I think there's about 12,000 of them at the very least along the 2,000-mile US Mexico border. So if you're walking, you step on one of these ground sensors, it sends off an alarm in the command and control center. It's like beep, beep, beep. And then they can send drones over to see what's going on, or helicopter, or fixed wing aircraft, or a whole other, their ATV units. They have a horse unit, all these different things at their disposal. And now there's more autonomous, what they call autonomous technology and artificial intelligence. So AI is being ingrained into almost everything. I think the most common tower now is an autonomous tower. There's a company called Anduril who's spearheading a lot of these autonomous towers, which then uses AI to be able to look for targets of interest. They call it targets of interest, and it just forms this massive like technological fortress. One agent, as an example, I was talking to an agent about one of the integrated fixed towers, and he told me it was as valuable as 100 agents. So they call it a force, quote unquote, force multiplier. It's one tower is worth 100 agents. So if you have 50 towers, it's 500 agents, right? And this idea that almost like the robotization of the Border Patrol. If you look and see, the Border Patrol kind of plateaus in terms of numbers at 2000, around 2012. They've been around 21,000 since 2012. But this upsurge of using technology, and now advancing, it's not quite there yet, but CBP brought robotic dogs, the robo dogs that could possibly become robotic Border Patrol agents, but they have at least two of them that they've conceded. And it remains to be seen. I suspect that one day we're going to see such dogs doing patrols on the border, and with people, agents using tablets to control what a dog sees, and that sort of dronization or dronification of what a border enforcement is. I think that is definitely a trend. And along with that, one other quick thing is the use of biometrics. Biometrics is a huge facet, and we're talking like facial recognition and iris recognition and digital fingerprints and that sort of thing. They are equipping some drones with facial recognition cameras, so you can see. So you're like dystopian science fiction novels from 20 years ago are kind of coming true on many parts of the border. At least the imagination of it is there, the kind of experimentation of it is there. What I would imagine, without knowing if some of this stuff is happening yet, if we're headed in that direction of robots and drones and artificial intelligence and facial recognition and the digitization of the border enforcement.
Yeah, it sounds like we've been there a little while. So, okay. So then we were, one of the things that, people think about the border and they think about, Paso, I think about Brownsville, I think about Nogales, they think about Tijuana, they think about, um, uh, these places. And then, but, uh, in one of, I believe it was Border Patrol Nation. I remember the story of people being arrested in a laundromat in, I believe it was Syracuse, or was it Rochester?
Close to Rochester. Very
Rochester.
close
See,
to Rochester.
it's been 10 years since I read that book, but I remember, see, this is what
Nice,
sticks
nice
out.
memory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I said, well, wait a minute, because again, I'm also from the Northeast and from the Mid-Atlantic and, even Florida, okay. But I'd never until I went, you really been on the border itself, but the border is what? What is legally the border?
Yeah. Yeah, that is legally Rochester, New York, believe it or not, is part of the border. And I think it was in 2005 in Rochester that CBP argued that they needed a border patrol, a CBP station, effectively a border patrol station in the city of Rochester. Okay, so viewers, listeners, imagine where Rochester is. Where's the border? Okay, Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario is to the north of Rochester, or it kind of is on the shoreline of Lake Ontario. And the reason why was because of a ferry service from Toronto to Rochester. So that was the justification. So they could put a CBP station there because Rochester falls well within the 100-mile jurisdiction of the border. The border, in fact, so again, imagine an orange band going around the contour of the United States from the 2,000-mile U.S. Mexico border up the coast, the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, and then across the 5,000-mile Canadian border, and then down the East Coast, all the way to Florida. And if it's 100 miles, just imagine what that covers, the cities it covers. That is a jurisdiction that the U.S. Border Patrol can use. It was determined in Supreme Court case in the 1940s and 50s. So this was determined a long time ago. And within that area, it's what the ACLU has called the Constitution Free Zone. They now do not want to call it the Constitution Free Zone because I mean they
Really?
already
Wow.
right
Yes.
they are
See?
yeah because
Yes.
you can't say it's Constitution Free Zone, right, because your technically exists and you have to argue something, right? But it's definitely a Constitution mangled zone. The I remember interviewing a CBP official in Washington for the CBP headquarters in Washington D.C. And he said we are quote unquote exempt. He used the word exempt from the Fourth Amendment, so the right not to be searched nor seized. Um, in other words, you can search or seize or anybody for using reasonable suspicion, and you can stop and interrogate people wherever, including putting up checkpoints, like the checkpoint that Senator Patrick Leahy went through. I believe it was 2008, and I believe it was just outside of Syracuse. So right on the very edge of the 100-mile zone. And
Yeah.
Patrick Leahy was stopped at the Border Patrol checkpoint. And then they asked him to get out of his car. According to Leahy's own testimony, he's a senior senator from Vermont, of course. According to his own testimony, the agent said, he asked him to get out of his car. And then Leahy asked the agent under whose authority, and the agent pointed to his gun and said, "That's the only authority I need." Um, so that's a sort of 100-mile zone story that actually was brought into light because it was a senior senator, as a senator of the U.S. government. But most of the stories do not get brought into light, like the one you just mentioned, Mark, the Sodus, New York one. That's Sodus. It's right outside of Rochester. It's a farming community where tons of farm workers come in around October for the harvest. And lo and behold, during that time, on Sundays, the New York State Police will put up a checkpoint. The checkpoint happens to be right next to the laundromat, the same laundromat that every worker uses on that only day off. And during these years, I don't know if they're still. I don't think they're still doing this. Actually, when I checked in on this recently, I heard they were not. But around 2008, 2009, a border patrol agent, because they can operate in this 100-mile zone, would hang with the New York State Police. And so, with a cooperation through what is known as Operation Stone Garden, which is this cooperation that between Department of Homeland Security and local police, state police, local police departments, they work with border enforcement. So there's a kind of gelling of border enforcement. And so if a worker would go use the laundromat, they didn't have, there was any sort of suspicion by police, or they didn't have a driver's license, they would be then given to Border Patrol. And Border Patrol would then, if they suspected them of not being undocumented, or then send them to they get arrested, then they'd be sent to Batavia, which Batavia is a big detention center, ICE detention center, right outside of Buffalo. And you can see how the whole US Mexico border replicates itself in its own unique way in the north, in this 100-mile zone in New York State.
Well, yeah, and I know that I was talking to a friend who's just he retired judge from not completely, I think maybe in September. They have this administrative leave, so I don't I gotta be a little careful. But he was saying that in that all of the immigration courts in Michigan are soon going to be detention courts because in part because of that. And I know Batavia is also an immigration court, so it also works that way. And then when people are in detention, it is much harder for them to afford a lawyer. I know that
Right.
personally right now because if everybody's being detained, and it's also very, true. And it's also much harder to do a case for people in detention because they detain them often far from where, lawyers might be. And they're also, they're not working. So it's hard to pay, etc. So that it's a whole system that brings it down. And I think when you talk about the layers, it's so true in that um, the layers are there. And you know what's still happening, and this is something that I can say, and it is, and it does suck, and it's an awful thing. Is the fentanyl and all of this stuff, and the amount of things that are laced with it, and people that are ODing accidentally. And where I've been around a bit, and I was in all through Ohio just now, and I've been in South Carolina, and those are the places where I'm right next to West Virginia, and these are the places where it is the most serious. And it's absolute, beyond anything else. What's done is that you've taken something that is a common thing that people want. I mean, people want security, people want to be safe. Nobody wants this idea, just in the original quote that I talked about from the proclamation, is that to draw battle lines of people in the United States between those who excuse murder and those who don't, those who those who don't care if there's people that OD from fentanyl, those who don't care if an awful crime happens, is part of this division that, to me, they're just non-starter conversations, and they're disgusting conversations. And to say that, um, to get into a zone where you say these immigrants are good, how can you say, well, no, but this one, broke into a house on the border, did something. Okay, well, I'm not going to say they're not. They're human. People are human beings. Yes, crime is less, but it's the same. It's the same theme as, people think this about a faraway border, and they don't address the issues as we all have one common goal. And one common goal is to have people be healthy and not have people in our communities, our families, suffer like that. And do I, and I know, look, what it does, I think personally, is it gets to a point, and I'm not saying people who are, on the left and aren't tired of it and sick of it and respond by saying, well, look at that, your husband just got deported, and you voted for Trump, so screw you. And it's like, all that's true, but those kids, that they still suffer, and people have different reasons for doing. And believe me, when your other option is, well, but we're gonna buy the paradigm, but we're gonna do it less cruelly, or we're gonna use technology, or what have you. People are people, and just the same as when you see people who are, I, I mean, some of the reddest areas I've been in are some of the places where I've seen the visually seen, in South Carolina, when I was in like rural area outside of Charleston, and I, took a walk at 7 in the morning and saw three guys walking down the road, and they looked like zombies, and it was clearly, or they were past. It's like, I'm not saying I don't know, how people vote or what people thought, but it's certainly not the narrative you hear. And so I think that this is something that's just grossly divided, and it's elitist. It's elitist. It's elitist, it's classist, and it's and it's disgusting. And speaking of elitist, classist, and disgusting, you went to an event in April at a so tell us about this event in April you went to.
Yeah, there's an event called the Border Security Expo, and it's the annual event. It brings in, it's often in convention centers. It's been going on since about 2005, I believe, the yearly event. And it started in Phoenix and it spent several years in San Antonio, and then it was in El Paso. It's called the Border Security Expo. And it's like a bringing together of ICE, high brass, the CBP high brass, DHS high brass, and sheriff's departments on the border, that sort of thing, along with private industry and private companies. And this year, after starting in Phoenix and then going to San Antonio and El Paso, returned to Phoenix. And this is, of course, this is the first year of the Trump administration. And so the keynote speakers were from that said administration. So we got to see Thomas Homan, who is the quote unquote border czar. Now, Mark, I'm trying to figure out, I've been doing journalism on the border forever, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what a border czar is. It's like this appointed position, and a lot of presidents don't have a border czar. And you go through history and you're like, well, who had the last border czar? And all of a sudden, this person's appointed a border czar, and they're not like Secretary of Department of Homeland Security.
Is he
It's
the
more of a
first?
consult. No, there's the last one I could find was Alan Burson, who was under the Obama administration, I believe. He was a border czar then, but that was over a decade ago. And then the same guy, Alan Burson, was also the Clinton in the 1990s. But there could be more, but it's not like an official position. But there was lots of big deals made of Thomas Homan, who is a former ICE commissioner, becoming the border czar of the Trump administration. He seems like in the Trump administration, Homan definitely seems to have clout and power, and that's he comes with at least that swagger. He had that swagger at the Border Security Expo. He came out swinging, and Kristi Noem was also there, of course. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, fresh off her in April. She was fresh off her visit to El Salvador, where she was visiting the big prison in El Salvador, donning her $50,000 watch. And she was one of the main keynotes at the Border Security Expo. Both Homan and Noem really, really were underscoring it was almost borderline delusional, in my opinion. They were underscoring the fact that the Trump administration had shut the border down within 3 months. They were talking about how they had reduced the number of crossings by 94%. I mean, of course, they were leaving out all kinds of information. The borders, there's a whole story of why there was a decrease of border crossings having to do with Biden administration in 2024 really amping up their cooperation with Mexico and southern Mexico to halt people crossing from the border there. But those are just little details that aren't mentioned, of course, and it's just all about it, how you look. And so at this event, there was a lot of the Trump administration talking about that. But you're also at the Border Security Expo. This event has been going on for years and years and years. And the reason why this event exists is because there's so much money now going into border and immigration enforcement. And you could tell, like, the people that were present, mainly industry in the audience, were very much applauding, what the Trump administration officials were saying, sensing, of course, what was to come, which is the beautiful act or whatever, the beautiful bill act or whatever you want to call it, that really does infuse like the border and immigration budgets with tons of more money than maybe comparable only to the 9/11 increases, post 9/11 increases. That they were sensing that was on the horizon of this building up this, what I would call a border industrial complex. It's clearly present, right? You have companies that are vying for contracts. and they get contracts, and it just entrenches. So the companies themselves, and there's from small startup companies to large Lockheed Martin military monolith, General Atomics, they do the drones, uh, Boeing type companies who have all kinds of clout in Washington behind closed doors, can lobby around appropriations and budgets, can give campaign contributions to key politicians, those in Homeland Security committees, those in appropriation committees, and thus ensure that our budgets and bills like the bill that just got passed in the summer will find their way down the conveyor belt and keep increasing the what when I first started doing this, for Border Patrol Nation in 2012, I was talking to companies that were like, okay, they're winding down our war, the military efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we're looking for a new market, and it looks like there's lots of money going into border and immigration. And so that new branch of a market is just increasing and increasing. And now, Mark, now when I was doing Border Patrol Nation research, I believe that projections were about $300 billion for the Homeland Security market globally. Globally, I'm talking all throughout the world. And now they're projecting it I think for 2030 or 2031, to be $1 trillion industry. And they are talking all the things that we're talking about, drugs, fentanyl, this stuff that you've been talking about, as drivers, but also climate change, the increased displacement of people is now a huge factor. It's almost in every market assessment. And we're talking about a market that is growing at a clip that people should find astonishing. And from the analysts that are looking at it, that are projecting that these things are going to grow, and they look at these things pretty in-depthly, they're showing that there's going to be only more and more border fortification globally as we progress into the next decade. So from that vantage point, it's very entrenched and very much a growing phenomenon, whether
So
it be in the United States or abroad.
So do you see some of that budget being used to get contracts or what have you with borders in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds. So these contracts, you mean the
Yeah,
U.S.
yeah.
money
Or
that
just the U.S. in some way using it to help block other borders.
Yeah, United States, particularly again since 9/11, has emphasized what they call the extension of the border or the externalization of its border. And the US has been working with, I wrote a book on this too, called Empire of Borders, has been working with more than 100 countries. When I wrote that book published in 2019, in that I did an assessment of more than 100 countries that the United States has worked with, done assessments and given I guess prescriptions, like border prescriptions, to those countries to then help them both bolster their borders, which often involves both trainings. So there's a whole faction of Border Patrol, BORTAC. Actually, that's the tactical unit of the U.S. Border Patrol that does like SWAT operations, but they also do international operations, and they go to other countries and they train. So they have that part of it, and they also have resource transfers. So like, for example, southern Mexico has gotten biometric kiosks, has gotten Black Hawk helicopters, has had trainings from U.S. Border Patrol agents, has had CBP agents on the ground in Tapachula, right on the Guatemalan border, in their immigration stations there. So there's all kinds of cooperation being done, and that has also involved with money going. Like in Mexico, there's this thing called the Merit Initiative, which has given Mexico billions of dollars. And part of it is to create a quote unquote 21st century border in Mexico, which then involves Mexico buying different products, which then means contracting with different companies and bolstering this global homeland border security market, if you could call it something. And that's just the Mexico example. you could go to any country, most countries, with the exception of maybe Cuba and maybe Venezuela, the usual exceptions, and find some sort of border enforcement in cahoots a lot with United States pressure or United States suggestions, depending on the country. And Mexico is a good example too, because the U.S. has put tons of pressure. Trump does it just right out in the open. I will put tariffs on you unless you do this. He did that actually. There's a lot of talk of his tariffs this time, but of course, Mark, you probably remember in his first term, he
Mhm.
also threatened Mexico with a number of tariffs unless they bolstered their border. It's southern border, and so if this is
Well,
that tariff thing threat has been going on for a
well,
while.
yeah, I mean, and I know that, with Honduras, they're basically an extension of, if there's agreement, if you come through Honduras, there are people that are in immigration court in the United States where they're stopping the hearings and saying, no, you can go to a court in Honduras and it's supposed to be equal. And we all know that the agreements that he has for deportation with countries like Eswatini and Uganda, Sudan, Rwanda, and
Right.
so so I guess, one of the other things that I want to, quickly touch on, and you write about it a lot, is, you know, when you mention Afghanistan, it just made me remember I did a lot of asylum cases from people from Afghanistan in the 2023, and what stuck me was this bloated complex. I mean, they talked about all the vehicles that were left there. Like, how come you didn't bring them all back? It's like, well, because you set up this bloated city and you sat there, and just the amount of infrastructure that was there, that was in Iraq, that they were looking at in I think Lebanon, supposed to have this insane complex of, the United States likes to go big, and then they like to and so and so and they all failed. They're all left behind. They all failed,
Mhm.
and they all were they were nothing, and in a sense. And so I'm wondering, like we're talking about the border, and I mean, are people going, I mean, if these communities become so militarized, and we know environmentally, I mean, we know this, like Fort Bragg, is laden with environmental lawsuits for people in North Carolina. We know that these institutions, the military, that they're awful for the environment, and we know that the Rio Grande Valley, much of the border is a pretty delicate ecosystem, like they all are, and so I'm wondering how much people are going to, what's going to happen to these communities if they become essentially military bases, police zones.
Like the
And
border.
yeah, yeah, like, free for all for, testing of weapon. Is it going to be something like the Bikini Islands, or Vieques in Puerto Rico, where people were, testing bombs, and it's almost like that, where there's so much not only commotion, but destruction, environmental destruction, and cultural destruction. I mean, having, this is not, it makes it extremely tense to live there. And I'm wondering, like, how are communities fighting back? How are communities responding? And what can people know and do?
Yeah, that's definitely what's happening. It's been happening on the U.S. Mexico border and border communities, like a total takeover of the border apparatus, which is hybrid, like border patrol. They call themselves paramilitary units, which might confuse people who like study paramilitary groups and places around the world. But what they mean is a hybrid military police unit, and it's definitely what they are. And there's been definitely militarizations of different communities. Of like, I just was listening to an interview with an artist in Nogales. They started a studio because of the militarization of the border, because of the razor wire. Actually, they put uh, there was raised coils and coils of razor wire put on the border wall, and that was it for them. They said, "Okay, we're going to have a conversation with this thing," because we wake up one morning and it's after small incrementations of a border being militarized, and a big wall, and more border patrol roaming around, running around, going super fast, all armed, shooting into Mexico, shooting at people, at times, chasing people. This whole like kind of deformation of what it was, right? Like even so, you talk to old timers, and in Nogales, for example, people talk about like the Cinco de Mayo parade going across the border, just zigzagging back and forth. And then that's can't be done anymore. That's just completely eliminated. Firefighters going to help, that sort of cooperation of people being able to, oh, there's a fire. Both the US side and Mexican side are going to go fight the fire. Not anymore because there's a big border wall, and that sort of cooperation is totally uh, cut off, right? Um, and and so that sort of like I one like from the artist, one quote was like, we woke up and it was like we're in a prison, right? We're in a big prison, and so there is like that, this is just one vantage point, but there is that fighting back. They in their case they started a studio. It's a cross border studio. They wanted to like then have art that would converse with what is going on and come up with new ideas and try to generate new ideas. And there was one quote that the director said, her name's Isa Huerta, and she said we want to be in a state where we don't feel like things are being done to us, that we are actually doing things, right? And I think that captures a spirit you see a lot on the border from different people. There's so many different organizations, there's a whole organizations around the violence of the border patrol that is binational, that has binational vigils. There's environmental organizations, the environmental destruction that you were just talking about, Mark, very, very relevant on the border, the creation of the border wall. Um, the it's just for anyone that cares about the Sonoran Desert, for example. The Sonoran Desert, it's the only desert where the saguaro cactus grows, and to watch the saguaro cactus topple to build a border wall, right? And the kind of ecosystems and all the photography we get now of different animals trying to cross, but they can't cross because of the border wall. There's all kinds of cross-border environmental groups that have come together that are addressing these issues, but also addressing issues like common issues that nation states, it's really ridiculous to like border boundary these issues like climate change. Do you think like climate change affects southern Arizona any different than northern Mexico? No, it's the same exact thing, same exact droughts, the same exact wildfires. Everything's the same. And so it makes a lot of sense. And that's what people are doing on the ground, that we come together and we're working together to try to harvest water. For example, there's water harvesting projects that are just inspiring, and it's done with these binational organizations and building up water tables that have been going down because of a super long drought for years, and all of a sudden they're going up, right? Because of these water harvesting projects, just to name a few things. So there's a sort of multi-pronged, multifaceted resistance to something that seems, on one hand, very overwhelming, but on the other, there's a community that's not necessarily in cahoots with what's going on. And you can go across border wide and find organization after organization that is, raising its concerns.
Well, and I know I'm, in some of the things I've read on your page, that you didn't just interview artists and all that. You talk to ranchers, you talk to people that live there, and there's a reality, and also, and I think this is the connection here in your nation's capital, which is, I actually live across the street from it, but I live in the neighborhood where our collaborationist mayor lives, and it's not affected by the influx of troops, etc., that are here. But I know people in Washington D.C. are very unnerved. It's very shocking because they see ICE walking around, and what was an idea for them, what was something that they didn't see, now they're seeing it. They're seeing, they're doing it all out in the open, and while that is unnerving and all of this, it is also making it real for people. And I think that this is all real, and it's hard, as a country where we don't um, have a whole lot of range in our opposition and views and accepted ideologies. This is it's not going to be resolved by a nice new election if we just let, things get bad enough. Then no, I mean, it's got to change the paradigm all the way around because the
Mm.
table was kind of set. The table was kind of set in so many ways by, just like the table was set in here by people thinking, well, these cities are places where, bad things happen and therefore there's an emergency. Yes, there's an emergency, but you don't have to be that bad there. I mean, I remember, Giuliani was popular for what he did in New York, and then people realized later on, okay, this guy really is, what he is, and this is not a way to resolve anything. And this is spreading to, this is what's going on in El Salvador. And right now where, okay, we can just jail 2% of the population and allow no opposition and that's it and things will be yeah it's going to be yeah people aren't going to cross the border as much um that because that wasn't a real thing in that threat wasn't really there. Drugs were not brought in on a speedboat coming out of Caracas now, but because people didn't look at that as absurd. I mean, people were beginning to. People were saying, okay, the lies are so apparent. The lies are so apparent that right now that it's I think it's ripe for people together, but folks need to like read the Border Chronicle, read accounts from the border, read listen to people and we got a bit of a you can the book the militarization of the border. We'll put that in our notes. We'll put a bit of we're compiling a reading list for people, but also look, there's videos, TikTok. I mean, information is everywhere now, and so don't and don't fall for don't fall for lazy narratives. Don't fall for lazy narratives and know that there can be stressful situations, um and there can be certainly it can really so far it's not as what one would think, but it's really going to lead to a lot of violence. And there has been a lot of violence on the border. There has been, just like in these cities, that this is scary. This is, it's these are scary things, and people need to say this is the country we want, and not look to. I mean, one of the lessons is we can't look to people to see, in politics. One, because they act out of fear, and two, because these tech companies live off it. They live off of the ability to continue to fund these things, and many of them donate to both parties, right? They donate to both parties. This complex is huge, and they create a narrative, that they're keeping us safe, and it's just not true. And so um, Todd, is there anything else that's burning for you?
No, just I have to go to a Border Conference meeting actually, and my and Melissa, who's my cohort, she is now wondering where I
Uh-oh, uh-oh,
am.
uh-oh,
So I'm getting
uh-oh.
text
Well,
messages
go,
from
go, go, go
Melissa,
to your. Well, that means you're important, I guess. That means she
but
didn't.
uh, but
That means she didn't
but
stage a coup.
no, but I think all you say is correct, Mark. And that yeah, like let's unpack the narratives a little bit more. There's so many ways to look at this in many different ways, and one of the first thing is just to find out what's really happening and the history of it and the context of it, and then work from there. And this um there's many ways to. It seems like the silver lining with Trump is that more people could become. He's so egregious and extreme with everything that more people become even aware of what some of this is. And now the key is when Trump goes out of office, just to keep at it, right? Like Trump is a phenomenon that that brings the extremes of this to the forefront, but then it continues after him. And then I think one of the keys is just to like keep keep don't lay back after it, for those who are really very concerned about what's happening. And people, I think, should be very concerned. And this, as we've discussed, this dystopia spreads from undocumented people to, everyone else, right?
Yep.
And
And
yeah,
and they can look on the Border Chronicle to see the different groups that are, you guys have the different environmental groups. I know you feature that people can support. There's a lot of them are
yeah,
small. And but they're all working really hard, and they do need help from people, even volunteers, what have you. So I mean, I know I volunteered there, and you don't have to be a lawyer. There's a lot of stuff to do. So thank you so much, Todd. We'll have you back. We'll have you back. And if not, we'll have
great.
Melissa, or you
Oh
guys.
yeah, yeah. We should
That
get
would be
Melissa
great.
on next time.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Get Melissa on next time, and go to your meeting. We'll talk to you later. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Talk to you later. Great to
All
be
right.
with you, Mark.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you. All right, take care. Bye bye. So again, we are produced by Stephanie Boutois. And thank you to Jeff Barsky for his intro and outro music, Insect Factory. And we will talk next week. I know there's Alligator Alcatraz has that decision is being litigated again because the judge's decision was put on hold. And we may do an episode from Alligator Alcatraz this week. So thank you.